I watched in horror as Sheriff Karen pulled a small baggie from my horse trailer and held it up to the light. White powder. My blood turned to ice as she smirked at me with those cold eyes. "Well, well," she said, her voice dripping with fake surprise. "Looks like we have ourselves a drug dealer." I had never seen that bag before in my life, but as she snapped the handcuffs on my wrists, I realized the truth. She had planted it there, and that was the moment I knew I was dealing with someone who would stop at nothing to destroy me. 6 months before that nightmare, my life was perfect. I woke up every morning at 5:30 to the sound of my rooster crowing and my horses nickering for their breakfast. The sun would rise over the rolling hills of my 40-acre ranch, painting everything in golden light that made me feel like the luckiest person alive. I had spent 15 years building this place from nothing. When I first bought the land, it was overgrown pasture with a falling-down barn and a house that leaked in 12 different places. But I saw potential where others saw problems. I saw freedom where others saw too much work. My neighbors thought I was crazy for choosing to live out here, 3 miles from the nearest subdivision. They could not understand why I wanted to deal with well water and septic systems when I could have city utilities and an HOA to handle all the maintenance. But that was exactly why I chose this life. I wanted to make my own decisions about my property. Every morning I would walk through my pastures checking on my horses and cattle. I knew each animal by name and personality. There was Thunder, my black gelding who always tried to steal apples from my pockets. There was Bella, my Jersey cow who followed me around like a giant dog. These animals were not just livestock to me. They were family. I had deliberately chosen property outside any subdivision or HOA jurisdiction. I researched the boundaries carefully before I bought, making sure I would never have to deal with someone else telling me how to live on my own land. The nearest HOA was for Meadowbrook Estates, a fancy subdivision about 2 miles down the road with perfectly manicured lawns and identical mailboxes. Sometimes I would see patrol cars driving slowly past my property. The sheriff's department had a route that went by my front gate. I always waved when I saw them, believing they were just keeping an eye on the rural properties. I thought they were the good guys. I should have paid more attention to the way they slowed down at my gate. I should have noticed how they seemed to be studying my property instead of just driving by. But I was naive then. I believed that living an honest life and minding my own business would keep me safe from trouble. The first time I saw Sheriff Karen, she was driving past my property in her patrol car. She stopped at my gate and stared at my horses grazing in the front pasture. When she saw me watching her from my porch, she did not wave back. She just put her car in drive and left. I remember thinking it was strange, but I pushed the thought away. I had work to do, fences to mend, animals to feed, and a life to live. I had no idea that Sheriff Karen was already planning to destroy everything I had worked so hard to build. The first time Sheriff Karen came to my gate, I thought it was a mistake. It was a Tuesday morning in March, and I was fixing a broken fence post when I heard her patrol car pull up to my driveway. She stepped out wearing mirrored sunglasses and a crisp uniform that looked like it had never seen a day of real work. "Ma'am," she said, her voice carrying more authority than the situation required, "I need to speak with you about some violations on your property." I walked over to the fence line, wiping my hands on my work gloves. "Violations? What kind of violations?" She pulled out a clipboard and started reading from it like she was delivering a court sentence. "Failure to maintain proper setbacks from the road. Livestock visible from public areas without proper screening. Non-compliance with residential appearance standards." I stared at her in confusion. I am sorry, but I think you have the wrong property. I am not part of any HOA. My land is outside all subdivision boundaries." Her jaw tightened, and she lowered her sunglasses to look at me directly. Her eyes were cold and calculating. "All properties in this area fall under the jurisdiction of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA. You received notification of this when you purchased your property." "No, I did not," I said firmly. "I specifically chose this property because it was outside any HOA boundaries. I have all the documentation to prove it." She stepped closer to my gate, and I could see the muscles in her neck tense with anger. "Ma'am, I am telling you that you are in violation of community standards. You have livestock running loose, your grass is too long, and your property is bringing down the value of the entire neighborhood." I felt my temper rising, but I kept my voice calm. "My horses are not running loose. They are in a fenced pasture on my own property, and my grass is not too long. It is a working ranch, not a suburban lawn." "Working ranch," she laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Lady, you have got a few horses and cows on 40 acres. That does not make you a rancher. That makes you a hobby farmer who is too stubborn to follow the rules." The insult stung, but I refused to let her see it. "I follow all the rules that apply to my property, but HOA rules do not apply here because I am not part of any HOA." She flipped through her clipboard and pulled out a business card. "You need to contact the HOA president immediately to discuss compliance. His name is Richard Martinez. He happens to be my husband." The pieces clicked together in my mind like a puzzle solving itself. This was not about property violations or community standards. This was personal. This was about power and control. "I understand your position," I said carefully, "but I am not going to contact anyone about compliance because I am not required to comply with rules that do not apply to my property." Sheriff Karen put her sunglasses back on and walked back toward her patrol car. But before she got in, she turned back to me with a smile that made my skin crawl. "Ma'am, let me give you some free advice. This can go easy or it can go hard. But one way or another, you are going to comply with community standards. I suggest you make the right choice." She drove away, leaving a cloud of dust hanging in the air. I stood there at my gate, watching her patrol car disappear down the road, and felt something cold settle in my stomach. This was not over. This was just the beginning. The harassment started the very next day. I was mucking out horse stalls when Deputy Williams pulled up to my gate. He was young, maybe 25, and he looked uncomfortable as he walked over to me. "Ma'am, I need to cite you for a noise violation," he said, not meeting my eyes. I leaned on my pitchfork and stared at him. "Noise violation? What noise?" "Your rooster was crowing at 5:30 this morning. That violates the quiet hours ordinance." I could not believe what I was hearing. "Officer, I live on a ranch. Roosters crow at dawn. That is what they do, and there is no quiet hours ordinance that applies to agricultural property." He handed me a citation anyway. "You can contest it in court if you want, but you still have to pay the fine." 2 days later, Deputy Martinez showed up with a citation for improper livestock containment. My horses were in the same pasture where they had been for 3 years, behind the same fence that had passed inspection when I bought the property. The next week brought citations for tall grass, even though my pastures were supposed to be grass. Then came citations for agricultural odors, because my horses and cows smelled like horses and cows. They cited me for having too many animals, even though I was well within the limits for agricultural zoning. Every citation came with a fine, $50 here, $100 there. It was death by 1,000 cuts, designed to bleed me dry slowly. I spent hours on the phone with city officials, trying to get someone to explain how HOA rules could apply to property that was not part of any HOA. Every person I spoke to gave me the same response. You need to speak with Sheriff Karen about that. The pattern became clear. Sheriff Karen was using her badge to enforce rules that did not exist, and everyone in the city government was too afraid of her to stand up for what was right. I started researching property records and discovered the truth. Sheriff Karen was married to Richard Martinez, who was not just the HOA president. He was also a member of the City Planning Commission and had financial interests in 3 different development companies that were buying up rural properties around town. My 40 acres sat right in the middle of land they wanted to develop into another subdivision. But they could not force me to sell as long as I was happy living there, so they decided to make me unhappy. The citations kept coming. Deputy after deputy, violation after violation. My mailbox filled up with legal notices and court dates. I was spending more time dealing with fake violations than I was spending on my ranch. The stress was taking its toll on my animals too. They could sense the tension every time a patrol car pulled up to our gate. My horses would run to the back of the pasture, and my cattle would huddle together like they were expecting danger. I tried to fight each citation individually, but the legal fees were adding up faster than I could pay them. I was being forced to choose between hearing lawyers and feeding my animals. They were systematically destroying my financial stability. The worst part was the isolation. My neighbors stopped talking to me because they were afraid of getting on Sheriff Karen's bad side. The feed store owner started treating me like a criminal because he heard I was being investigated for violations. Even my veterinarian started asking questions about whether my animals were properly cared for. I was being painted as a problem property owner who refused to follow the rules. But the rules they were trying to enforce did not apply to my property. I was being punished for living independently and refusing to submit to their authority. 3 months into the harassment campaign, I received a letter from the city attorney stating that my property was being declared a public nuisance, and that I had 30 days to come into compliance or face legal action to remove my animals. That night, I sat on my porch with my dog at my feet and my horses grazing peacefully in the moonlight. I had 2 choices: give up and let them win, or fight back with everything I had. I chose to fight. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning in June. I was feeding my horses when I saw 3 patrol cars pull up to my gate. Sheriff Karen stepped out of the first car, followed by 4 deputies I had never seen before. "We have a warrant to search your property," she announced, waving a piece of paper in the air. My heart started pounding. A warrant for what? Illegal structures, drug activity, weapons violations. She smiled that cold smile I had come to hate. "Stand aside, ma'am, we are coming in." I watched in horror as they stormed onto my property like they were raiding a drug cartel. They tore through my barn, throwing around tools and equipment that had taken me years to organize. They scattered my feed bins, knocked over water buckets, and sent my horses running in panic. "This is harassment," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "You know there are no illegal structures here. You know I am not involved in any drug activity." Sheriff Karen ignored me and continued directing her deputies. They went through my house, my workshop, and even my chicken coop. They were looking for anything they could use against me. In my workshop, they found my grandfather's rifle collection. The guns were legally owned and properly stored, but Sheriff Karen acted like she had discovered a weapons cache. "Well, well," she said, pulling out my grandfather's hunting rifle. "Looks like we have an illegal weapon stockpile." "Those are legal firearms," I said. "I have all the proper documentation." "We will see about that." She nodded to one of her deputies. "Bag them as evidence." That was when I knew this was not about violations or compliance. This was about destroying me completely. They were going to plant evidence, file false charges, and use the legal system to take everything I owned. As they loaded my grandfather's guns into their patrol cars, I felt something break inside me. These weapons had been in my family for 3 generations. They were not just firearms. They were family heirlooms with stories and memories attached to every scratch and dent. "You cannot take those," I said, stepping toward the deputy with the evidence bags. Sheriff Karen was on me in seconds, grabbing my arm and spinning me around. "You are interfering with a police investigation. That is a felony." The handcuffs clicked around my wrists, and I felt the metal bite into my skin. Standing there in my own driveway, watching my neighbors peek through their curtains, I realized how completely they had destroyed my reputation in the community. "You have the right to remain silent," Sheriff Karen said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." But I did not remain silent. "This is illegal," I said. "You are abusing your power and everyone knows it." "Ma'am, you are making this worse for yourself. I suggest you stop talking." They put me in the back of a patrol car and drove me to the county jail. I sat in a holding cell for 6 hours before a lawyer finally showed up to get me released. The charges were dropped 24 hours later when the district attorney realized they had no case. But the damage was done. The local newspaper ran a story about the ranch raid that made me sound like a dangerous criminal. My photograph was on the front page under a headline that read, "Local Woman Arrested in Weapons Investigation." When I got home, my property looked like a war zone. They had left gates open, scattered my tools, and damaged equipment that I could not afford to replace. My animals were traumatized and skittish. It took me 3 days just to clean up the mess they had made. That night I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee and made a decision. They had pushed me too far. They had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. If they wanted a war, I was going to give them one. But I was not going to fight with lawyers and citations. I was going to fight with the truth. The day after the raid, I drove to the electronics store and bought a small digital recorder. From that moment on, every interaction with Sheriff Karen and her deputies was going to be documented. I started researching everything I could find about Sheriff Karen Martinez and her husband Richard. What I discovered made my blood boil. They had been running this same scheme for years, targeting property owners who stood in the way of development projects. I found records of at least 6 other property owners who had been harassed out of their homes over the past 3 years. Each case followed the same pattern: fake citations, escalating harassment, and eventual forced sales to development companies connected to Richard Martinez. The Martinez family had made millions of dollars buying rural properties at below-market prices after the owners had been driven to bankruptcy by legal fees and harassment. It was a sophisticated criminal enterprise disguised as law enforcement. I drove to the county courthouse and spent days going through public records. I found the connection between Richard Martinez and 3 development companies. I found the bank records showing suspicious payments to Sheriff Karen's campaign fund. I found the pattern of property acquisitions that followed harassment campaigns. But I needed more than just financial records. I needed proof of the harassment itself. I reached out to the other property owners who had been targeted. Most of them were too afraid to talk, but a few agreed to meet with me privately. Their stories were heartbreaking and eerily similar to mine. Sarah Chen had been forced to sell her horse farm after Sheriff Karen cited her for agricultural violations that did not exist. The property was now a shopping center owned by one of Richard Martinez's companies. Tom Wilson had lost his family's 100-year-old ranch after being arrested on false charges of animal cruelty. The charges were dropped, but the legal fees bankrupted him. His property was now a luxury subdivision called Wilson's Ridge. Each story followed the same pattern: harassment, false charges, financial ruin, and forced sale. But now I had proof that this was not just about my property. This was a systematic criminal enterprise. I started carrying the digital recorder everywhere. When Deputy Williams showed up with another fake citation, I recorded the entire conversation. When Sheriff Karen called to threaten me with more legal action, I recorded every word. The recordings revealed the truth about their operation. Sheriff Karen was using her badge to terrorize property owners into selling their land. She was not a law enforcement officer. She was a criminal in uniform. I also discovered that several city council members had received campaign contributions from Richard Martinez's companies. The corruption went all the way to the top of the city government. I spent weeks documenting everything: financial records, property transfers, campaign contributions, and recorded conversations. I built a case that would expose the entire criminal enterprise. But I knew that going to the local authorities would be useless. Sheriff Karen had too much power and too many connections. I needed to take this to someone who could not be intimidated or bought. I contacted the FBI field office in the state capitol and requested a meeting with a federal agent. I told them I had evidence of a criminal conspiracy involving a county sheriff and systematic violations of civil rights. 3 days later, I received a call from Special Agent Rebecca Torres. She wanted to see my evidence. As I prepared for that meeting, I felt something I had not felt in months: hope. The monthly town hall meeting was scheduled for the first Tuesday in September. Sheriff Karen was going to receive a commendation from the city council for her outstanding service to the community. It was the perfect opportunity to expose the truth. I spent the week before the meeting preparing my presentation. I organized my evidence into clear categories: financial corruption, abuse of power, false arrests, and systematic harassment. I had recordings, documents, and testimony from other victims. The town hall was packed that night. Sheriff Karen sat in the front row wearing her dress uniform, complete with ribbons and medals. She looked confident and relaxed, like someone who had never worried about consequences. Mayor Johnson introduced her with glowing praise. Sheriff Karen Martinez has brought law and order to our community. Under her leadership, property values have increased and quality of life has improved for all residents. The audience applauded politely. I sat in the back, my hands sweaty and my heart pounding. I had requested time to speak during the public comment period, but I had not told them what I planned to say. When they called my name, I walked to the podium carrying a folder full of evidence. Sheriff Karen turned to look at me, and I saw her eyes narrow with suspicion. "Good evening," I said, my voice steady despite my nerves. "My name is Jennifer Walsh, and I own a ranch outside the city limits. I am here tonight to talk about Sheriff Karen Martinez and her definition of law and order." A murmur went through the crowd. Mayor Johnson looked confused. Sheriff Karen's face had gone pale. For the past 6 months, Sheriff Martinez has been using her badge to harass me and other property owners. She has filed false charges, conducted illegal searches, and used her position to intimidate citizens who refuse to submit to her authority. Now hold on, Mayor Johnson interrupted. This is not the appropriate forum for. Actually, it is, I said firmly. The public has a right to know what their sheriff is doing in their name. I opened my folder and pulled out the first document. This is a citation for noise violations because my rooster crowed at dawn. This is a citation for agricultural odors because my ranch smells like animals. This is a citation for tall grass in my pasture. I held up each document so the crowd could see them. These citations are for violations of HOA rules that do not apply to my property, but Sheriff Martinez has been using her badge to enforce them anyway. Sheriff Karen stood up. This woman is a disgruntled property owner who refuses to follow community standards. She has been uncooperative and... I have recordings, I said, cutting her off. I have recordings of Sheriff Martinez and her deputies admitting that they know these citations are invalid. I pulled out my digital recorder and pressed play. Sheriff Karen's voice filled the room. I do not care what the property records say. You are going to comply with community standards, or I am going to make your life a living hell. The silence in the room was deafening. I could see people looking at each other with shock and confusion. I also have financial records showing that Sheriff Martinez's husband has made millions of dollars buying properties from owners who were harassed by her department. I pulled out the bank statements and property transfer documents. Richard Martinez owns companies that have purchased at least 6 properties after the owners were driven to bankruptcy by harassment from his wife's department. Mayor Johnson was staring at the documents with his mouth open. City council members were whispering to each other frantically. Sheriff Karen was standing now, her face red with anger. This is a coordinated attack on law enforcement. This woman is a criminal who... Actually, I said, I am a citizen who has been the victim of criminal behavior by a corrupt sheriff. That was when Sarah Chen stood up in the audience. She is telling the truth. Sheriff Martinez destroyed my family's farm with fake citations and false charges. Then Tom Wilson stood up. She did the same thing to me. I lost everything because of her harassment. One by one, other victims stood up and added their voices to mine. The room filled with stories of harassment, false charges, and financial ruin. The pattern was undeniable. Sheriff Karen tried to regain control of the narrative, but it was too late. The truth was out, and the community could see it clearly. This meeting is adjourned, Mayor Johnson announced, his voice shaking. But the real meeting was just beginning. As people filed out of the room, they surrounded me with questions and support. The spell of fear that Sheriff Karen had cast over the community was finally broken. The town hall meeting was recorded by the local cable access channel and uploaded to the internet within hours. By the next morning, the video had been shared thousands of times across social media. The story of Sheriff Karen's corruption spread like wildfire. The state attorney general's office called me on Wednesday morning. They wanted copies of all my evidence and recordings. The FBI contacted me that afternoon to schedule a formal interview. The dominoes were starting to fall. Local reporters descended on the town like a swarm of locusts. They interviewed victims, reviewed public records, and started connecting dots that went far beyond just Sheriff Karen and her husband. The corruption scandal reached into the city council, the planning commission, and several local businesses. Sheriff Karen's first instinct was to double down on her lies. She held a press conference where she claimed that I was a disgruntled criminal who was trying to destroy law enforcement. But the recordings I had released made her denials sound ridiculous. Then she tried to intimidate the other victims into staying quiet. She sent deputies to visit Sarah Chen and Tom Wilson, warning them about the consequences of making false accusations against a law enforcement officer. But instead of scaring them, it just gave them more evidence of her criminal behavior. The FBI began conducting interviews with current and former deputies in Sheriff Karen's department. What they discovered was a culture of corruption that went back years. Deputies were ordered to harass specific property owners, falsify reports, and ignore constitutional rights. Anyone who refused to participate was transferred to other departments or fired. Deputy Williams, the young officer who had cited me for my rooster crowing, came forward with evidence of the harassment campaign. He had been keeping his own records because he knew what they were doing was wrong, but he had been too afraid to speak up. The financial investigation revealed the full scope of the Martinez family's criminal enterprise. They had made over $12 million through their scheme of harassment, forced sales, and development kickbacks. The money trail connected them to dozens of properties and multiple shell companies. Richard Martinez tried to distance himself from his wife's actions, but the evidence showed he was the mastermind behind the operation. He had been using his position on the Planning Commission to identify target properties, and then his wife used her badge to force the owners to sell. The pressure became too much for their marriage to survive. Richard filed for divorce and began cooperating with the federal investigation in exchange for a plea deal. He provided evidence of Sheriff Karen's direct involvement in the financial aspects of their scheme. Sheriff Karen's world was collapsing around her. Her campaign contributors demanded their money back. Her political allies distanced themselves from her scandal. The county commissioners began discussing the process for removing her from office. She tried one last desperate attempt to save herself by claiming that she was the victim of a political witch hunt by property owners who wanted to destroy law and order. But the evidence against her was overwhelming, and public opinion had turned completely against her. The federal grand jury handed down indictments on a Thursday morning in November. Sheriff Karen Martinez was charged with conspiracy, extortion, civil rights violations, and racketeering. Richard Martinez was charged with conspiracy, fraud, and money laundering. The local newspaper that had once published my photograph under headlines about weapons investigations now ran a front-page story about the corrupt sheriff who had been destroying lives for personal profit. I stood in my pasture that morning, watching my horses graze peacefully in the sunrise, and felt something I had not felt in a long time: peace. The nightmare was finally over. Sheriff Karen Martinez resigned in disgrace on a cold December morning. She did not make a statement or hold a press conference. She simply cleaned out her office, turned in her badge, and drove away from the sheriff's department for the last time. But resignation was not enough to save her from the consequences of her crimes. The federal trial began in March, and the evidence against her was overwhelming. The jury took less than 4 hours to find her guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to 12 years in federal prison. As she was led away in handcuffs, I thought about all the lives she had destroyed and all the families she had torn apart with her abuse of power. Justice was finally being served. Richard Martinez received 8 years in prison after his cooperation with the federal investigation. His development companies were forced into bankruptcy, and all the properties they had acquired through harassment were put up for sale. Several of the original owners were able to buy back their family land at fair market prices. The civil lawsuits came next. I joined with the other victims in a class action lawsuit against the county for allowing Sheriff Karen's corruption to continue unchecked. The settlement was substantial enough to compensate us for our legal fees, property damage, and emotional distress. I used my settlement money to make improvements to my ranch that I had been putting off for years. I built a new barn, upgraded my fencing, and bought 2 more horses. My property was finally the place I had always dreamed it could be. The new sheriff, Patricia Hayes, was a complete opposite of her predecessor. She was honest, professional, and committed to actually serving the community instead of exploiting it. She instituted new policies to prevent abuse of power and established a citizen review board to investigate complaints against deputies. The city government also underwent major changes. 3 city council members were voted out of office in the next election, and new regulations were put in place to prevent conflicts of interest and corruption. The Planning Commission was completely restructured with new oversight and transparency requirements. I became something of a reluctant hero in the community. People would stop me at the grocery store to thank me for standing up to Sheriff Karen. Other property owners asked for my advice when they had problems with local government. I never wanted to be an activist, but I had learned that sometimes good people have to stand up to bad people in positions of power. The best part of the whole experience was reconnecting with my neighbors. Once Sheriff Karen's reign of terror ended, people were no longer afraid to associate with me. They realized that I had never been the problem. The problem had been a corrupt sheriff who used fear and intimidation to control the community. My horses and cattle thrived in the peaceful environment. They were no longer stressed by the constant presence of patrol cars and hostile deputies. My rooster crowed at dawn without fear of noise violation citations. My grass grew as long as it needed to grow because it was a pasture, not a suburban lawn. I learned valuable lessons about the importance of standing up to corruption, even when it seems impossible to win. I learned that truth is more powerful than badges and uniforms. I learned that justice sometimes takes time, but it does eventually come. Most importantly, I learned that freedom is not free. It requires constant vigilance and the courage to fight for what is right, even when the odds seem stacked against you. Today, I wake up every morning to the sound of my rooster crowing and my horses nickering for their breakfast. The sun still rises over the rolling hills of my 40-acre ranch, painting everything in golden light. But now that light represents something more than just a beautiful sunrise. It represents the triumph of truth over corruption, justice over abuse of power, and the enduring strength of the American spirit. Sheriff Karen Martinez is serving her sentence in federal prison. My ranch is still here, still independent, still free. And that is exactly how it should be.